While it's absolutely true that ancient Egyptians wrote on papyrus, and not only did they write on these papyri papers, but these clean notes have made their way all the way up to us. And these notes make it seem as if this is the main way they used to write. Obviously, they used to write on walls as well, and they used to write on stone, and they used to write on smaller tablets, even on clay sometimes, in the same way that the Sumerians would write. But something that is different about how they got here is that papyri is an expensive thing, even in ancient Egypt. It's not something that you can just use every single day. Fine, it got really popular, and just like almost every other invention, if you can find a later version of it, probably the earlier version is where it all started. And so you get the ancient Greeks, you get the ancient Romans, and all these other people imitating this papyri, and then later it becomes a forgotten art, and then people start writing on parchment, and they start writing on other things, including, seals. Of course, there's seals from all around the world, but papyri was a thing. So how then do countries that imitated Egypt, like Sudan, how then do they end up with things like this? Drawing tablets. These drawing tablets, which we have already explored, seem to arc back all the way to ancient Egypt. And it might seem like it is not a direct connection, but you can't really think of another reason why they would be very limited to Africa and why they would start in very specific regions and grow in that way. And of course, the shapes again are a very curious thing. In order to go there, we would have to look at this specific image. This image, which you can tell by a few things, looks like an ancient Egyptian carving, but in fact, it is from Sudan. It is a Meroitic carving, or part of the Meroitic kingdom, the Kushite kingdom writing. Look at the woman. You can see with the headgear that there's something a little different about it. And then you can also see the others. From the Meroitics, the Kushites, the other people who were in Sudan who mimicked the ancient Egyptians, it is possible that there was a transfer of technology. But wait a minute, didn't the ancient Egyptians write on papyrus? How does papyrus turn into wood? And of course, if you think about it, there's some people who could talk about the transfer from wood to paper, beating the paper up, which this did happen in China or Indonesia, where you first use wood blocks or wood panels, and eventually you realize, oh, you could beat the paper up and then you could get paper. Now, of course, in Indonesia it was a little different, but in China it worked that way, which is why we can see people writing on wood and then eventually become paper. But in Egypt, that didn't happen. Does that mean that the ancient Egyptians did not write on wood? The answer to that question is obviously no. And in fact, it's the complete opposite. In 2018, along the Nile, a large amount of stone was found. Inscribed of it was the Meroitic script. It is one of the newer discoveries that have helped try to decipher the Meroitic language in a much deeper way. Now, of course, this type of writing is known throughout Egypt, and a lot of these are funerary texts. These funerary texts are not a great example of the writing that would come later, or Quranic texts, but it is interesting that they are of a religious nature. But we still need to go years back. because again, we're looking for wood. We know that there was at least some form of wood in ancient Egypt, but again, how does it transfer from Egypt to Sudan? Well, this goes back to the founder of writing in ancient Egypt. His name is Thoth. Thoth, the ibis, or in other cases, he's made into an ape or a baboon. This person is thought to be the founder, and what he is holding in his hand is not papyrus. You can see it, the way that it stands straight, that it's not papyrus. In fact, he is holding a piece of wood and he is writing on it. Now, why would he be holding a piece of wood and writing on it? But that's because the ancient Egyptians didn't just write on papyri. In fact, writing on papyri was the final draft. That was when you've already figured out what you wanted to do. Just like in rock, you don't practice on the rock. You have to practice time and time again on some surface that is forgiving, some kind of surface that will allow you to do what you do in a clear way, but then will sort of act stencilish to that papyri or to the other things. Now, this might have led some people to creating things like seals, right? Because the transfer, but let's not even go that far yet. If we just take a piece of wood and you write on it and then you rub it out because it's a piece of wood, depending on how well that piece of wood is cut and what you put on the surface of wood, it can be very forgiving. Now, of course, you could think to yourself, well, maybe it's not a piece of wood because it's not that clear. And maybe it isn't clear. Maybe it's not. But I want you to look at this scribe here. This is a learning scribe. And you can see here that the scribe has the same type of structure on his knee that Thoth had before. It clearly shows two holes and then a section to write in. This is interesting because you don't see two holes in papyri at any point in history whatsoever. Papyri is just a piece of paper. So what exactly is he holding, and what is the scribe holding himself? These pieces of wood are very different than just drawing panels, but you can see here that they're often shown blocky and big, and like I said, they are easy to remove things on. And so we should assume that they are first draft papers or first draft wood panels or wood pallets. So enough guessing. What exactly is he holding? Well, if you can see, he's not writing on this piece of wood. Instead, this is stationary. As you can see, when I say stationary, I mean the stationery that kids use at school. You can see that he's holding a pen in his hand or a piece of grass, which is being used as a pen. And on the top is a piece that is black used for paint. And at the bottom is another circle, and that also is for holding paint. You can even see a slit over his hand, and you can see that there are two pens that are inside of the piece of wood. Something like this. This ancient Egyptian way of writing is very old, and of course, you can see how someone like Thoth, who's very organized, would have his stationery put in something like this. But this is not writing on wood. This is basically keeping the paint on wood. Given how valuable papyrus is, obviously, you could not allow students to learn on papyrus because that would be a waste of money. And so they did not waste money. Instead, they took their time learning on pieces of wood. And eventually, when you get expert and you are neat with your writing and you are carefully selected, you can do the job of being a scribe. Now, obviously, we know that they obviously used papyrus once they became expert. And in fact, they sometimes trained on papyrus as well when they were intermediate or they were in a growing phase. All of these have different names, which we will get into in another period, but it's more important to understand this. There's weights and weights of panels or tablets that are made showing ancient Egyptian inscriptions from ancient Egypt. And you can see that they're painted with a little bit of a white so that you can see easily the stuff that is written on it. And this is one of the mistakes that people make, which is they grab the pieces of wood and then they color, when they make remakes, they color them white thinking that it's a piece of paper, but in some cases it's not even what you would write on, as you see with Thoth. So how do we go from stone funerary tablets to wooden tablets? Well, the connection might be much more simpler than we think. But first, let us look at these. These are examples of the scribe set. As you can see, the scribe has a wooden block to write on with the typical white stuff over the wood, and then he's stationary. Now, obviously, this is from 2400 BC, so it's not in great shape. Here is another one, and you can see that this tablet is pretty much a rectangle with no extra anything. There is nothing about it that would seem unique to this part of the world or completely different. Now, of course, as I mentioned, wood was used in a lot of places around the world for writing, so it's not like it is 100% unique, but the shapes are. Thoth is not just seen as a writer, he's also seen as the divine writer for the dead, and he is also seen as one of the judges of the dead. And in that role, death and writing become connected in a way that can never truly be separated. These pieces of wood are called Egyptian wooden tags, and these tags were used in the same way that a stele or anything like that would be used to identify the person who is being buried. A lot of them were actually used in workshops. So, in other words, they were used before they are put, a stone one is put there. And in some cases, it is still inside next to the body itself. Even this tradition went even through the Greek times, as you can see over here. And all of these wooden tags would be a first stage for a lot of them, if we read. This, by the way, is from the Fayum mummies. Most of the 1,000 or so mummy portraits known to survive today are separated from the remains of the people they portray. Many also are missing the wooden tags that were often attached to the mummies, inscribed with their names of the dead and other identifiers. Mummy labels read clockwise from top left in Greek: Horus, son of Senomithus, stonecutter, and in Demotic, the Osiris Hor, son of Senomoth, the stonecutter and priest of Imhotep, in Greek, Peleus, son of Apollonius. He lived 58 years. In Greek, Anakbok, Enebuen, son of Artademus, be of good cheer, and in Greek, Plenis, the younger son of Marinus, he lived 35 years. These labels, which we can see written here, did work like the stele or tombstone, and we'll get back to the stone ones. It says here the labels helped embalmers avoid mixing up bodies, but had a deeper purpose, said Thum. It also kind of functions like a memorial, almost like a tombstone or a stele. Curators borrowed several mummy tags for the exhibition, even though they don't match up to the portraits on view. A lot of the exhibit is about what's not here, said Thumb. What can we learn from what's left? So you can see here that again, these wooden things would be utilized. Well, in some cases in the Fayum period, they would just go for what it is. But in other cases, they were sort of a rough cut of what would eventually be put on rock, so you don't mix it up, you don't get it wrong, you don't do any of that stuff. Seen here is another one of wood, right? Wrong. This is made of stone. You can almost see how the wooden tablets are being mimicked over here, and you can see how they transfer. Now, we don't just have one direction of transfer, as the Coptics in Egypt and in Sudan as well, because they exist there as well, they also wrote on wood, and some of them still write on wood. As you can see with these tablets here that are of the Coptics. But let's go to the later Meroitic writings. As you can see here, these Meroitic writings, of course, are attached to the stele, and you can imagine that they had the same problems. Not wanting to do a first draft on a piece of stone, you would do it on a piece of wood, and then, or the final draft, or the final piece. You don't want to do it on a piece of wood, so you would, a piece of stone, so you would do it on a piece of wood, and then you would adjust it later, well, probably over and over again until you get it perfect, and then you do it just copying. You don't even have, the person copying doesn't even have to understand what they're copying. It's easy to forget that the Sudanese did not just go from ancient Egyptian to Muslim. Instead, they had a transition where they first became Christian. Still sticking to their own script, they started writing the Bible in their own writing. And you can see all around this person that exists. And they also started picking up other concepts like writing on parchment. And that's when they transitioned into Christianity in Alodia, in Mukuria, in Nobatia. All of these show that there is a slow transition away from the ancient Egyptian religion, although they still stuck to some of their old ways. Wooden tablets went on the decline. The reason for this, of course, is because they were starting to use parchment. The only thing they started using the wooden tablets for was as portable. In other words, not in the religious centers, as we still find some, but not that many back then. Now, also, another thing that happened is that they started writing also in the Greek language. In Byzantine Egypt, we still have a lot of these pieces of wood being utilized during this time. It is funny that the ancient Egyptian way of writing, which was done on papyri and also wood, transitioned all the way back to the Sudanese areas where really it was first developed. With wooden pieces like these that still have stuff left over for us, and seen in some places, if you pay attention, you can see washed off pieces of ink Like ancient Egypt, we can read that these boards are used for the same reason. Quranic boards are used by students to write out extracts from the Quran or to practice their writing of particular verses. These are usually washed off after each use, a bit like a slate and chalk. They are generally flat, rectangular, and with a handle at one end, occasionally both. This Quranic board was made in Sudan. This one was also made in Sudan. But this one's history is much more interesting. It's made somewhere in Central or West Africa, and then it makes its way all the way to Egypt because that's where it was found. So I'm just going to throw this in here. Isn't it funny how Moses, who was in Egypt according to the story, went to the Sinai and found himself some tablets which were written the context of the Judeo faith or the Ten Commandments. Well, this proves that you can take the people out of Egypt, but you can't take the Egypt out of the people. As it says, when the Lord finished speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him two tablets of the covenant law, the tablets of stone inscribed by the finger of God.